We encourage inappropriateness.
Okay. Thoughts, comments, feedbacks, corrections. Certainly, like you shouldn't just sit there and take that as
I'll swallow this gospel.
as a gospel. Take it as propaganda. As a guy making a point.
I will say it's kind of a catch-22. Like, let's study the Bible, but you don't need the Bible.
What you said about how Jesus never wrote anything down and never acted as though he wanted to, like, that he was prioritizing recording anything.
Yeah.
That was kind of a mind blow moment for me. Like, wow, oh my gosh, yes, that's right. He was a teacher, but he never wrote or recorded anything. How many, like, most spiritual teachers, that's kind of how they roll. That's what they do. They're all about, here are my teachings, and that's not what he did. And I don't think a lot about that because I love that, and I don't even quite know why yet.
Mm-hmm.
That never occurred to me.
And not only does he not, the Gospels don't sort of portray that they did, right? They don't. There's this really famous bit from Monty Python, right, which you might know, where I don't remember which one it is. Life of Brian. Yeah, where they're standing in the back of this crowd and they're looking and they say, "What did he say? Blessed be the cheesemakers." Cheesemakers? Yeah, well, it could be confectioners of all kinds, do you think? No, he said cheesemakers. And they have this argument about blessed be the cheesemakers, right, instead of peacemakers. And the sort of idea, right, in that is, oh, people probably misheard or something. The Gospels, and maybe it's just a first century thing, but they don't like try to say, and so-and-so was following around and wrote all these things down. They don't try to solve that problem. That's not even a thing they're getting after, is the idea that these are the official teachings of Jesus. The way they're narrated, the way that they're told, they're not being set up as a Jesus-authorized version. There's a movie coming out that I saw a preview for, and it's called Paul the Apostle. It looked really interesting. It comes out March 23rd or 28th or something. It's for Easter. Actors that are kind of in real movies. It's a real movie. Then I saw that there's some church people that are really supportive of it, so it kind of freaked me out. But it might be. It might actually be good. I don't know. But in this, it's the story of Luke. So they take the vantage point that Luke is the one responsible for the Gospel of Luke and for the book of Acts. And Luke finds Paul in prison and says, "We need to start recording this stuff that you're writing and saying. This matters. This has to be held." Paul's like, "I don't want to do that. I don't think that's how this goes. This isn't really going. I'm in jail. This isn't working." And so the drama of this is Luke trying to pull it out of Paul, right? It's a really interesting premise. And I hope the movie's good. I don't know. But that's, I think, a way to think about what's going on. It's the gospel writer's idea to put a gospel around this stuff. Jesus isn't presented as someone, even though on occasion, two times in the Gospel of John, Jesus is referred to as a rabbi. I have a whole other shtick I'll unfold on you sometime, that Jesus not only is not a rabbi by first century standards, he's the anti-rabbi. He is not pitching a hang on all of my words and let me reinterpret for you Torah in a new and fresh way in the midst of the Midrash. He's doing the opposite of that. He's saying things like, the work that I do, you're going to do even greater works than these because I'm going away to the Father. The Spirit will remind you all the things that I've said, but you don't have to write all this stuff down. I'm not setting up a school. I'm not your master teacher. That's not what we're doing here. Jesus in the Gospels is not presented in that way. He's presented in this much more empowering way, going around saying to people, you're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. Rise up and be. That's the story that he's doing. He's not doing this kind of class, and maybe it's just my imagination about what a first century rabbi is, but he's not establishing a school. He's not doing a Hillelian kind of thing. He's going to have a bunch of disciples that are going to hang on all of his words and are going to take his teaching. That's just not what the Gospels portray about Jesus. So I think the fact that he didn't write and didn't or even they didn't even purport to cast Jesus in that way. Is something really dynamic about the Gospels and tells us how we're supposed to understand the content and what's coming from.
But if he had 12 disciples, isn't that like his own school that he set up?
Okay, here's why I would say maybe not, because what he does with the way he what they do as his disciples is something sort of different than just take the teachings and go. There's even this thing, I think it's in Luke or maybe it's in Matthew, Luke or Matthew, where he sends them out 2 by 2. What gospel is that? You remember? Matthew. And he puts them together and he says, sort of go out 2 by 2. When you go into a town, if you speak your peace, if you say your shalom and it doesn't get returned to you, knock the dust off your feet and then come back. And so they kind of go out and then they sort of come back and they're like, we don't know what's going on. If he's establishing a teaching school of like his disciples that are going to hang on all of his words, they're misunderstanding. They're not getting it to a really high degree. In the Gospels, they're more the foil of the misunderstanding the teaching than they are being set up as the downline. The Gospels don't do a very good job of Jesus, of saying, Jesus said these things, the disciples who followed in his way heard these things, they went and told other people these things, and so on and so on and so on. Instead, it is the gospel, the disciples misunderstood. They didn't understand. It wasn't until later that they knew this was how it's going to happen. And then they betrayed him. And then Jesus had to say, that's not how this thing's going to go. We're not going to have those kinds of fights. Put the sword away. They're not really set up in a way that, again, this is a bit of my expectations about, but it's hard to read those and think, oh yeah, no, these guys all totally got it. Jesus was such a master teacher that he just sort of laid this onto his disciples. They carried it, and we have this flawless sense of a school. Rather, it's more like this this life school that you get out of this thing, out of the Gospels. It's a sense that there's growth and development happening, and it's starting to come to them and dawn on them only later what all this means. Yeah, you're smirking already. Do you have a good one?
Well, I think it's really good.
And on the video, you have a whole white wall behind you, so it looks like you're speaking from the.
Well, so Doug talked a lot about, the Gospels are pitches. And to understand that they're not pitching us, because we are so far disconnected from.
Yeah.
So they're pitching a particular person, people group, whatever. Like the Gospel of Matthew in particular is pitching to Jewish followers that Jesus is the culmination of your story and he's the hope that you've been waiting for, and through him you have the opportunity to now usher in the goal in which Israel is always supposed to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth, and it's through they did not do very well at that through the Old Testament, and now here's Jesus. He's coming to fulfill their mission, and now that's done. We're all done with that, and now go forth and create micro communities throughout the world. But one of the ways in which Matthew does that, so he's writing in a way that first century Jewish people would be like, very obvious to them. It's not a secret. It's not a mystery. He wants them to understand. And Israel was waiting for the day in which they would no longer live in exile, and their 12 tribes would be united and have kind of, political power in the land. And as Doug said, the Gospels are very counter to the first century understanding of Judaism, this being one of them. So Matthew he appoints 12 disciples. The 12 tribes have been reinstated. Israel is now at the center of power, symbolically, in Matthew. And then he goes forward to say, this is what it means to be a Jesus person. I'm going to do a miracle. And then Peter's like, what are you doing? No one understands what you're doing. He's like, everybody understands what I'm doing except for you. Here's some woman on the side of the road who's touching my cloak and healing, and you have no idea what I'm talking about. Here's some Roman, some pagan who's asking me to heal his son, and you have no idea what I'm talking about. So he does that on this journey to Jerusalem. There's some conflict with the disciple, or there's a miracle that Jesus does. The disciples don't understand. Some nobody does understand. And then the temple is destroyed. So all throughout Matthew, I think he's using the disciples to set up the fact that you guys have kind of failed on understanding your purpose in the role, and no longer are we have a hierarchy, political dominance. All of it's kind of tied together. And Luke does it in Acts too.
Do you think, Curdy, that using that imagery, then instead of gathering together the 12 tribes for some sort of political power, the sending of them is sort of the dispersing of that power rather than centering?
Well, I think it's incredibly telling in Luke when they're all waiting at Pentecost. All the disciples are gathered waiting for the sign. You know, Luke and Acts are one big book. The end of Luke, he's like, okay, wait for the sign. Everyone wait for the sign. You'll know what's coming. And in Acts, it's like, oh, here's the sign. Pentecost. Everyone's, babbling in tongues and whatever. Now we're supposed to go. We're supposed to go. This is very clear. It's like over and over. Like, okay, when you get the sign, everyone go. When you get the sign, everyone go. So here comes Pentecost. And what did the disciples do? They chill. They sit in Jerusalem and they wait. And lots of things happen up until the martyrdom of Stephen. Where so finally some random dude that no one has known about is martyred. He gives a speech. All of a sudden, the whole gospel, and the disciples are mentioned like one other time in the rest of the book. But now finally, Christianity takes off like wildfire. So yeah, I think it's totally incredible. And Stephen says in his thing, like, who you thought you could contain God in a temple. You thought you could contain him in a holy hill. The world is his footstool, and he dies. And so, and then the disciples are gone. So yes, I do think that's exactly what it's doing.
Yeah. Others, thoughts, reactions? I know for the people like to process. You'll think for a few days on this, but feel free to.
There's two thoughts that I have that kind of connect together, and then I have my own agenda of what that connection does that I think really matters in this world. The first part is that you talked a lot about the four Gospels being very different and having their own particular agendas. But very early on, and you can correct me of who it was, but there was a person in a kind of group of people that wanted to harmonize these together, the Gospels together, and then that being a part of the canon. Not Irenaeus. Who am I? I don't know what Christian history. Anyway, there was an impetus to do that, but that was declared heretical, and there was I think for good reasons, a stand that said, no, we have four different Gospels, and even though they say very different things and do very, very different things, we're going to not try to harmonize that, but we're going to respect their differences and hold that in tension. I think there's something great about that. So there was that happened. That connects me to something I learned this past fall in seminary, and I was in a biblical interpretation class. And the professor that we had was kind of in a school of hermeneutics or biblical interpretation of process hermeneutics, which in lieu of process theology, which I'm very compelled by. And process hermeneutics kind of posits that, and you were very much alluding to this, that this person has this agenda and interprets an event or a passage or whatever it might be this way, and we can certainly consider that, carefully reflect on that, study it, understand it, but we still have to make this decision of whether we're going to hold to something similar of the same agenda that person may be interpreting this passage or event as. And so it still respects what he would say is the otherness of the text or the otherness of the event, but at the same time, still respecting your own self and your own desires and agenda, and not trying to harmonize them, but respecting one another. The reason why I think that's important is that it connects to the way that we seem to understand not just like theology or biblical hermeneutics or whatever, but like when we recognize the otherness of something, that something might have its own agenda and it might be different than our agenda. And when we start to harmonize it, that's when typically some sort of supremacy starts to creep in. So if I just said the word theology, more than likely you're going to think of a theology or theological framework by white straight men, right? And so the supremacy of being hetero and cisgender and a male will that is seen as the norm. But when you start naming something in its otherness, that's when that supremacy is being subverted. And I think that really has huge implications of the way that we understand each other, in part because we start to recognize the otherness of a person, that their agenda and their hopes and dreams are going to be maybe different than ours. But if we elevate one's hopes and dreams as the normal or the standard, that's when suppression creeps in. And I think that's what happens when we start to harmonize different events or different texts. And so that's why I think it's really important for the just even practical implications of not harmonizing something, but recognizing the different agendas that are going on and respecting those different agendas.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. And you can see that in some ways in the title of the books, right? There's this, which is sort of the least, which probably comes least from the authors and more from the curators. If you look in what the title of a gospel is written is the gospel according to Mark, the gospel according to Matthew. We did this sermon thing around here a few years ago where we asked people to be like, the gospel according to Alex. Alex, tell us what the gospel is according to you. There's this question, I've dealt with it for a lot of my life, and it's been very frustrating. It comes up still a lot because of the professional work I'm in, where people ask one another and others, what is the gospel? As if the gospel is a thing. Well, curiously, the good news gospel, the good news according to Matthew might be it's a retelling of the tribes of Israel narrative that opens this up to a whole other group of people. The good news according to John is going to be a different set of narratives. And the good news according to Kim is going to be something else. But that's what we're called to do, right? That acting out of not harmonizing, but of having this multi-voiced narrative about what the good news is actually what the Bible gives us. That's the funny thing about the fact that the Bible itself is this book that is doing one thing, and then we tend to treat it by its name and its power we give it as if it's supposed to function in another way. And then it doesn't function very well in that way. And it's no wonder that people get so, confused maybe, or just kind of bored or just tired of it or start fighting over it. There's a guy named Neil deGrasse Tyson, you know who that is? He's a scientist, and he was on a podcast or radio show or something I heard him on, and he had this really interesting line. He said, very Neil deGrasse Tyson way of saying things, he says, as a scientist, as if scientists all function in a certain way, right? But anyway, he says, as a scientist, I have a operating thesis that if you're in a discussion with someone and it goes more than 3 times back and forth, the argument that you're having, and you can't solve the argument after 3 times back and forth, then you're not arguing about the thing you're arguing about. You're arguing about something else, and you're not sure what it is that you're arguing about. Because he says, there's just enough empirical evidence in the world that someone would say, I think that A, I think B, here's why it's A, here's why it's B, I see that it's B, you're right, it's B. That's all it should do. It shouldn't go any further than that. If you're not doing that, you're not arguing about A and B, you're arguing about something else. So figure out what it is you're arguing about, because it's not that thing. That's a really curious sort of way to think of it. And there's an awful lot of arguments about the Bible that are not about the Bible. they're about the use of the Bible, they're about our understanding of the Bible, they're about the power of the Bible, or they're about all these other things, without actually ever letting it be about the Bible in some really odd way. While there's all kinds of difference, there's not as much conflict. I'd suggested, in last week's presentation, that there's this big choice in the Hebrew Scriptures about, you can follow this sacrificial narrative, or are you going to follow this non-sacrificial narrative? And it sort of frames the whole thing. I think it's got a lot to do with what's going on. Same thing in the New Testament. Where does the authority lie? It's this huge question. And Jesus is like, what I do because I'm operating and doing the works of my Father who sent me. And if I'm in you and you're in me and the Father's in me and I'm in you, and you go do the works of the Father, and then that's it. That's where the authority lies, is in what it is that you do. And then people come around and they say things like, who gave you the authority to say that? He's like, that's good. Do you believe me? No. How about the works I'm doing? If you don't believe me, just believe the works I'm doing. That should be enough. No. And it's a big fight about authority. And most of our struggles with the Bible are centered around authority. And I get that. That's an important thing. I'm trying to make an argument for the authority as being a dispersed authority, right? I'm willing to make the argument myself. I think it really matters because we do an awful lot of damage to one another when it becomes an authority grab over someone else. That's why Jesus' thing about all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, and I give it to you, and what you bind on earth will be bound on earth, and what you bind in heaven will be bound in heaven. Like, hey, let's just undo all this authority stuff and say, you've all got it. You all have the same authority I have. You have all the authority. All the authority that I have is all of it. And I say all of you have it too. So there. And instead of that being this democratization of authority, it literally gets interpreted as, no, Jesus has all the authority. Like, the opposite was the whole point of that statement, where then he says to them, therefore what you bind on earth will be bound on earth. I just find it, it's incredible to me, the level to which I have, and certainly other people have, misunderstood it to a point of it almost becoming a parody of the thing. And it can make you feel like you're the one that's so, I feel this way all the time, like, honestly, am I crazy? How is it that I understand? Like, I'm not trying to be a cult leader and like break the thing. I'm trying to be the opposite of that. Like, I don't know. Why is this so? Why do I keep hearing so many people say all the other things? And honestly, there have been times in my 34 years in this where I thought, I must just be out of my mind. I'm missing something. I need to read something else. I need to listen to something. There's no way people could be getting this back asswards. Like, that's not possible. And then just like, oh my gosh, I really think we're getting it. Like, and there's a conspiratorial impulse, I think, that we all have to be like, we should figure out why. Like, whose fingerprints are on this thing? What's going on? Is there a Russian bot somewhere that's doing something? Like, how is this? All right. So, any last thoughts, comments, inputs, questions?
I would say that, kind of going up to what you said, in my mind, it's very, 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 very important to separate and keep separate authority and interpretation.
Uh-huh.
When we approach the text, like Mason said, any text, when you are doing good interpretation, we don't need a spiritual hermeneutic. We don't need a special a spiritual way to interpret the Bible. If we can learn how to interpret the text well, and let it be the other, let it be what it is, that is a different process than choosing whether or not what it says has authority in my life. You're making two separate claims. You're learning interpretation, and I believe, Carolyn, what, like you said, we don't need the Bible. We do need the Bible. Like, I agree with Doug. We don't need the Bible, but there's some beautiful, life-changing things in the Bible because it does speak to human existence. It's like the greatest classic that remains. which you uncover by letting it be what it is, and then you make connections in your life, and you know, take that into the 21st century. But you can't read it from the perspective of the 21st century and to say, I'm going to read this, I'm going to interpret it, I'm going to understand the story, and then I'm going to give it some authority in my life is two separate things.
Yeah, that's yeah. I remember I was at Bethel College as a college student, and I remember being in a discussion in a Bible class, and there being this strange moment where I thought, I think most people in this room believe God because they believe the Bible. And so I asked sort of that question in some way. I can't remember how it was. And it started this whole conversation about, do you ultimately is your confidence in the Bible and therefore the Bible helps you believe in God? Or is it the other way, that your belief in God then allows you to have some sort of confidence in the Bible to extract some? And it's just so clear. And sometimes I'm a bit of a prepositional nerd. Not that I'm good with prepositions. I just think they really matter. So if your belief is in the Bible, that's just different than you believe in God, which actually is even different than if you just believe God. Like, can you drop the word in from the whole thing? But there's an awful lot of Christian faith that has been organized around the first argument being the Bible is trustworthy, and if you read it, that will lead you to God. And I think the Christian narrative is the God that holds you, calls you to fullness of life, and animates your life with the richness of the fullness of the love and life of God. And that will help you to engage in a Christian narrative of which the Bible is an important part. Those are just really different storylines, and I'm totally comfortable with, like, if you know, that whole thing with some question, like, if all the Bible was found to be wrong, or if you ripped it all out, or if you didn't have it or anything. I guess it's because I came to Christian faith not knowing anything in the Bible. Like, I saw a little play on a screen at a church and heard this story, and I was all in. And then I went the next day to a bookstore and bought a Bible and started reading it. So I know this is classic, you know, your story becomes the narrative by which you think everyone else should understand the world. But I just think, no, believe God first and then see what that does with the Bible is way better than having your faith be in the Bible. And I know why, and I know the history of why the Bible became really the third member of the Trinity, you know, the Father, Son, and Holy Scriptures, and that sort of notion. I get all that, and but it feels to me like that's the thing that we just have to be free to set aside. That God, the Spirit of God, the animating life of God, the Holy Spirit, whatever that is present in humanity, is the driving, animating force of our lives and our faith, not the way that's articulated in a set of deeply held and dearly held scriptures. We'll talk about Paul next week, the letters of Paul. I'm going to make a suggestion that there's some books that were not written by Paul, even though they bear his name. It'll be the most conspiratorial I will ever be on probably any topic ever. I really do think that there's some that were written by a pseudo Paul to try to disrupt the narrative and is put under his name. And most of the things that most of us don't like about the Apostle Paul are in those very few books. And it's the greatest get out of jail free card that I have around the Bible. So I really do think it's true. And it's also awfully convenient. It just, as it turns out, all of those books and passages and phrases. But to borrow one phrase from the writings of the Pauls, this whole thing about the Bible being that the Scripture, as he would call it, probably the Hebrew Scriptures, are God breathed or God fueled, God empowered, God powered, and therefore, that's a great line, profitable for correction, for how's it go? Are useful for correction, for teaching, and for training in righteousness. I think I missed a phrase in it. Paul, a big, I think, advocate of that whole thing, says, you know what the God-breathed scripture is? Really, really useful and helpful and good and profitable and can help you live in a really good way. He doesn't say it's the beginning and the end. He doesn't say it's necessary. He doesn't say it's inarguable. He doesn't say it's infallible. All the things that we tend to do with it, we've just ratcheted it up to a degree. So I think that's a perspective that I would hold about the Gospels, that they're really great. Should be taken on their own. I think it's, I think they should be harmonized quite to the degree that I have them harmonized in my own head. Maybe you all do too. Highly harmonized. Some of that because I was hearing things from all over and I didn't know where they came from. It didn't seem to matter. If Jesus said it, that's what mattered, not which gospel told you Jesus said it. And that's a thing. That's a function that some of us sort of have to unravel a bit, because we all have a conglomerate. There's at least 5 gospels for most of us: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the one that got put together in our head that's a little bit of all those and little bits and pieces. And it's hard to ever know which one we're dealing with at any given point. So, any other last thoughts, comments, questions?
I think I can just say, I feel refreshed personally, just from like the last hour. Because my question that I was going to say at the beginning of like what I thought about last week was, I just want to know that I can still like be a Christian or like have a Christian like faith and this idea of the divine, and I don't have to have the Bible, because I mentioned last week the letter I got and stuff, and it just feels like I still, like, when I had this like crisis of belief a few years ago, it felt like my previous self told me I can't call myself Christian and not think all of the Bible is this holy grail, holy glory. And so I just keep asking. I was even asking Kim this week, like, can I just like still live and have this sense of this like trajectory that I want to keep going on and teach my children and talk amongst each other and not have to have this Bible? Like, my dad literally said, I have to accept the gospel or reject it in his letter. And that just feels like, whew. And it feels refreshing that, your teachings or my talks with Kim or some other scholar that I'm reading, like, we're all, like, I don't know, it's maybe not so scary for me to accept, like, Hannah's gospel, or to walk Hannah's gospel. So thanks. I like the idea of taking into account what's their agenda. I think going forward, it's like that's a great way to approach the Gospels, and also churches. That's the way it's confused or misrepresented. So I'm not sure. Like, if we just understand that, like, either subliminally or intentionally, in power, often that's where it gets confusing. Like, this anti-establishment faith that we have, those turn into an institution. I don't know. That was really helpful. Remembering the agenda.
Hannah, sorry, were you finished?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hannah, you and I went to the same school,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of talk about infallibility and what's the other one? Infallible and inerrancy. I don't even know the difference, but basically means it's perfect or something like that. And there was something that just really, it was the reason I like, one of probably like 4 reasons I like ran as fast as I could out of that space. And then there was, as I kind of studied some of the older traditions, I don't know what catechism it's in, but, Episcopal, Anglican, that sort of world, they talk about it as sufficient. Scriptures are sufficient.
Yeah.
They're sufficient for salvation. I just really like that idea. Like, they're good enough.
Yeah.
And it just really
the duct
resonates
tape.
with what
The
you're
duct tape.
talking about. And I'm just like, yeah, they're good enough. I mean, we have them. And I guess we're good. I mean, if we're not good enough, I mean, I guess we're all screwed. But I guess they're sufficient, or none of us are sufficient.
Yeah.
So I just find that comical. Something with a few hundred more years of history is maybe a little more accurate.
Yeah, if you want to stick around, we can talk about the development of the word inerrant and infallible and where they came from and how they were designed in the late 1950s to answer a whole set of problems. They're extremely new and they're made up words.
They're hilarious.
I mean, they really just are. Like there's a lot of made up words. That's what we do with words. We make up words. That's where they come from.
But so many things are tools of control or organization, and then it becomes domination.
Yeah, and that was going to be my conclusion too. That this is pretty subversive stuff, and it's just human nature to want to dominate, control, organize. And how do you run a successful religious organization if you don't have some kind of power structure?
Yeah.
These words, well, you just kind of brush them aside and don't take them that seriously, or
Well, the Roman Empire was
Don't-
really an empire
Don't
Yeah.
in the business of subjugating other people.
And it's like that whether it's, in religion or politics or business or education or anything, at the schools, and you have to delineate, okay, what's in, what's out, and it's tough to not have those definitions sometimes.
Yeah.
And how do you live a life where you're not, following some sort of a rule or some kind of a school, whether it's the disciples of Jesus or Socrates or whatever. It's tough.
Yeah.
How do you keep something together?
Jesus does this interesting thing, right? Like with Sabbath, which is sort of the ultimate
Yeah.
religious notion for the Jewish community of the first century, because Sabbath is the one teaching that goes back not to Moses, but goes back to the created order. On the seventh day, God rested and made the day holy. So be holy and keep the Sabbath, right? Earlier. And then Jesus says, well, Sabbath was made to benefit humans, not humans for the Sabbath. So what we should do is, and that notion that you can have a rule that is to benefit humanity, and that's the line. And when you cross over into humanity having to benefit the rule, then you know it's gone bad. So maybe there's some way. And I've often wondered if it, I think it's possible that the teachings of Jesus can be articulated in a religion. We just haven't seen it yet. But I think it's possible that could actually maybe someday show up. It hasn't really been.
Maybe one day we'll do it sufficiently.
I have a friend that says about capitalism. He says, I think it's possible to be a Christian Calvinist or a Christian capitalist. Never met one, but I think it's possible. It's got to be possible, right? That's an interesting way to think about that. Maybe what the agenda of Jesus was to be an end of religion, not the establishment of one.
I thought the Holy Spirit somehow factors in, right? Like, you're supposed to be led by the Spirit. Or I kept thinking of like a coffee shop, like a cool indie coffee shop, and they're like, everyone else make cool indie coffee shops. And then Rome is Starbucks, and they made it all corporate and made them. They all have to be the same. And,
Like this metaphor.
Yeah.
Good.
All right.
Your metaphors are great.